Hey everyone, welcome to a Plain Accounts podcast. I'm Alicia McClintic here with my co-host Ben Cremer, and we are here to discuss the gospel lection this week. We'll pick up Luke where we left off. What episode number are we on?
We are on episode 133.
133. Wow, great. I'm so excited that you all have joined us here to have us talk a little bit about the scriptures. It's something that we love to do, and we're stoked to dive in. Ben, you're coming back from a big conference on mission lately, yeah?
Yeah, M19. I'm sure many of our listeners had a chance to attend as well. I found the whole conference theme on evangelism and reimagining that for the Church of the Nazarene to be really encouraging, especially the first sermon by the Hongs from, I always forget their district in California.
Stop it.
I have terrible with names of districts. So
They're from Northern California. They're my district
Okay.
superintendent couple.
What's my district? Okay.
Intermountain?
What?
Somewhere in
You're not
Idaho?
supposed to know that. Come on.
I have a great memory. I'm a good friend.
Okay. Wow. Well, I'm sorry. I have a terrible memory, but I try to be a good friend.
I know you do. I'm sorry.
All that to say, their sermon should be uploaded on M19 site. Go listen to it. It's been one of the most inspiring, thoughtful, and challenging sermons I think I've heard in a while. And helping me to reimagine evangelism, not just for the global church, but for my local context as well. So I'm coming back really energized and encouraged by that.
Super cool. We're really excited that you had such an enriching experience. And I know that some of those thoughts and ideas and reflections that you've been working through will make their way into some of our conversations in the future. And I'm excited to bring that to our listeners as well. So.
As am I.
Great. Well, I had just a normal week, a regular old Sunday situation.
Hey, but you were on the big screen at M19, so your
Stop it. No, I wasn't.
The Hongs were there, and they were talking, and then they said all these Facebook friends, and your face was like right in the middle of it.
Oh my God.
So you still made an appearance wherever, even though you were away. So
yeah, there was a great big NorCal representation at M19, which is fun. It's really exciting to be a part of this like great global family in the Church of the Nazarene, and really excited to for this energy on our district. We're really proud to be parts of these conversations that are reflecting on mission and vision and what does that mean. So
yeah, that's awesome.
Well, shall we dive into the scripture?
We shall.
We are in Luke chapter 6, picking up where we left off from the Sermon on the Plain, starting in verse 27. I'll be reading from the CEB today. But I say to you who are willing to hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone slaps you on the cheek, offer the other one as well. If someone takes your coat, don't withhold your shirt either. Give to everyone who asks, and don't demand your things back from those who take them. Treat people in the same way that you want them to treat you. If you love those who love you, why should you be commended? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, why should you be commended? Even sinners do that. If you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, why should you be commended? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be paid back in full. Instead, love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. If you do, you will have a great reward. You will be acting the way children of the Most High act, for God is kind to ungrateful and wicked people. Be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. Don't judge, and you won't be judged. Don't condemn, and you won't be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good portion, packed down, firmly shaken, and overflowing, will fall into your lap. The portion you give will determine the portion you receive in return. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God. Wow, there's a lot there.
No kidding.
Yeah. Where should we start? What jumps out to you?
Well, I think at least preliminarily, it'd be good to note that this is a continuation of Jesus' sermon on the plain. So this understanding the context of who's listening, where Jesus is saying these words, might be helpful for the preacher to remind the congregation of it's kind of a continuation of that sermon. So that was helpful for me to at least reimagine again and remind myself where this is taking place, so that when he says, "But I say to you," like who's the you? Like who is he talking to there? And it's those disciples that he's still teaching at that moment. Um,
Yeah, all the people who stuck around after he said,
yeah,
you're happy when you suffer, and woe to you
yeah,
who
right,
you're doomed if you're rich.
right,
So
right.
to
All those
everyone
that
who
stick
stuck
around.
around
Yeah, yeah.
to hear the rest of the sermon, this is
Hmm.
what he
The
said.
four people that are still there. Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, I think that drawing some connections, if you're preaching through the gospel passages, having a callback to last week's sermon about these kind of big picture ideals, we really get to drill down into specifics in this week. That like
Mhm.
Jesus comes with some really concrete and tangible actions
Right.
as this part of the sermon.
Hmm. And I love how the CEB stated verse 27, but I say to you who are willing to
Mm.
hear, love your enemies. And there's just a lot that can be played with there. Is there a willingness to even hear those words or that command, let alone follow it? That's a convicting one for me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So help me imagine a bit more of what you're pointing at with the practical application. So Jesus has given this incredible sermon at the beginning, and now he's moving towards the kind of the practical application of this sermon. And he's starting off, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Going through kind of these very tangible, concrete actions.
Yeah. And then he gets even more specific with if somebody hits you, if somebody slaps you across
Mm-hmm.
the cheek, turn to them the other one as well. And if someone demands your coat, give them your shirt too. If somebody asks for money,
Mm-hmm.
lend it to them freely, give it to them. Don't
Right.
expect any payment back. And it's hard not to hear the context of like an imperial rule
Mm-hmm.
in this space. Remember, we have the Roman occupation of Israel at this time, and so you have soldiers who are frequently um, uh, demanding things from people, conscripting people to carry their stuff for a mile, or demanding a coat. You have tax collectors who are frequently demanding more than is required. That there is a system at play, an exploitative system that's demanding folks to give more than they can.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Jesus is saying, give it to them. Uh, yeah, which is really interesting. It's really
Yeah.
difficult to wrap our heads around like what Jesus is saying.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but uh, yeah, I also find it really compelling too.
It absolutely is. I read a commentator that may be an interesting side note to what you're saying and might add some more helpful questions, because it's bringing up a lot of questions for me, because Jesus is speaking to not those necessarily in positions of power or the wealthy, right? He's talking to poor fishermen, to the impoverished of the land there. And um, the commentator mentioned that in that system where of imperial rule, kindness was seen through a lens of reciprocity. So, like, if you're kind to someone, it was not to your enemy. It wasn't to the imperial rule. It was kind to those in your inner circle who you wanted to be kind to. But there was an expectation there that it would be reciprocated back. So it was like a kindness that was given with an expectation that kindness would be returned. And so Jesus is kind of blowing that whole structure apart, that you're not just kind to those you love, for doesn't the world already do that? So love those who are outside that as well, and not expecting anything in return. um, this is a hard lesson. Like, even some of the financial hardships that I've been through doesn't even come close to the context and who he's speaking to right here. And I would hear that as a hard message to those who are dealing with hunger and thirst on a daily basis. And so, what sort of helpful ways, Alicia, can we kind of approach that really hard message to the context that he's preaching into here?
Yeah, totally. A couple of things. That reciprocity of kindness, or having only a reciprocal relationship,
Mhm.
is a survival mechanism.
Right,
It's
right.
like and a survival mechanism of communities on the margins and communities who are oppressed. I look out for me, and
Mm,
I will be kind to you if you will give me something back. But
right.
but first and foremost, survival. And Jesus is saying, uh, we are called into something bigger and deeper than just survival. And actually, to move from surviving into thriving, we must be a people who are inherently kind. Uh,
Mm,
so there's that there, that Jesus is like blowing up the look out for me first, and I must be committed first and foremost to my own survival. And then I think also Jesus is inviting them into a different kind of way. So marginalized and oppressed communities, especially when we're talking about this imperial rule or this imperial power, um, uh, can can feel like there is no recourse to them, that the only way that they can survive is by sticking together, by sticking to that like
mm,
survival mode way of being. And Jesus is offering another way, a way that actually points out the violence inherent in the system of
mm,
imperial rule by by um by submitting to this violence and oppression in a way that reveals it for what it truly is. So if a soldier slaps you, turn the other cheek,
mm.
offer your body to be abused again, right? A
Ugh,
sort of that sort of spotlights this this violence and oppression in a way that one would hope would awaken the consciousness of a community.
yeah.
Um, I can't remember whether it's in this text or not, but there's a similar passage in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, where Jesus points out, if somebody asks for you to carry their bag, or to carry a load for a mile, go with them too. So
Mhm.
the context at the time had set a cap on the work that you could conscript people to do. So you
Right.
could ask somebody to carry your pack for a mile, but no more. So if you are conscripted and you go willingly for a mile and then go willingly for two, then the soldier who has conscripted you suddenly gets nervous. Like, is my
Mhm.
commanding officer going to notice? Like, are they going to think I'm breaking the rules? It begins to awaken this consciousness and point out the ways the system is inherently violent, inherently oppressive, and and can be transformative in a way that perhaps meeting violence with
Mhm.
violence could never be.
Right. Wow, that's really good. I think there was a similar conscript with just property that Romans could take coats, for example, from those who needed it. And sometimes I heard that there's kind of a mistranslation between coat and mat at times. That it was more of like the attire for outer wear. So anything like that could be conscripted by a Roman soldier or just a Roman citizen. And so for that act again, instead of it being a distance in mile, it's like, here, take my shirt as well. And like, what shame that would be. It's like, I'm naked now. Like, to say I'm not defined, like the violence that's inherent in this conscript is not going to keep me from following the will of my God to be compassionate. I'm not going to respond to that violence with more violence. I'm going to be extremely generous in response to that.
Right. And then to lean into God's way of kindness, compassion, generosity, love into the most extreme,
Mm-hmm.
then I think continues to spotlight the hidden violence or the hidden oppression,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like the more you are extremely generous, the more it spotlights the ways that the empire isn't. The
right,
more that you are
right.
extremely loving and kind, the more
Mm-hmm.
it spotlights the way that the oppressors are not,
Yeah,
right?
right. Which I think maybe to kind of unpack the deeper call here, I want to at least muse a little bit of some reflections from M19 and the kind of reimagining evangelism for the global church, let alone the church in the Western context. That when I hear passages like this, especially growing up, I felt this inherent burden or weight as if it was all up to me to respond, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile. That loving my enemy was just and only my individual responsibility. When it seems as though Jesus is calling a people to embody the realm of the kingdom, and this is a mode of evangelism. That responding, that when a people are inherently shaped by the kindness and the mercy and the love and the justice of God, then it is a communal embodiment of the realm of God's kingdom, and not just only an individual responsibility. And in light of that, I feel like we have functioned with such an individualistic perspective of evangelism and more of an inward private relationship with God, that we don't seek this um, communal evangelism to evangelize communities for the sake of the kingdom, to see this kindness become a culture, like a culture of God's kingdom lived out, and that God's justice is carried out by essentially being who we are called to be. And that action then flows out, and we respond to these ways that the world responds because we can't help but be shaped by the kingdom we're called into. So I'm kind of like reflecting with that mode, and I think I'll head that way this Sunday. But do you feel like that's heading down the right path with this passage?
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much there that you said. I just think back to my own experience growing up in the church, and there definitely is a sense of the simplistic preaching of these passages when I felt like the general message was like, you don't get cookies for being nice to people who are nice.
Mhm.
Like that's I feel like that's Jesus's message here is like everybody does that. Everyone's nice to people
Right.
who are nice. Like you don't get cookies for that.
Mhm.
And that the work then is to love the people who are unlovable,
Right.
to then I mean even further to love the people who hate you, who despise you, who hurt you, all of those things. To love the enemies, this kind of enemy love. Um, the kind of love that transforms enemies into friends. Like this
Mhm.
is the way we eliminate enemies,
Yeah.
not by violence, but by turning them into friends.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and so I remember in like, Sunday school and then like high school youth group and those spaces kind of walking away with this like inordinate responsibility. Like this is my job. I
Mhm.
just have to try to be extra nice to these terrible people.
Right.
um and I don't think that that's what Jesus is
Yeah.
saying. I do think that Jesus is saying by the power of God in you, as you identify as a colony of the kingdom of heaven here and now, as you identify as children of God, as you identify as people shaped by the very character of God that is light and love and peace and justice, then out of that overflow, you respond. with love and kindness,
Right.
light and love and peace and justice. It is this overflow of your identity, not a task list that you're trying to check off.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking about that, the ways that we need to emphasize who we are becoming as disciples and not what we're doing,
Mhm.
if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. And then also in faith-based community development, we talk a lot about institutional neighborliness, or what it means
Mm.
as a community to be a neighbor to another community, like as a faith community to be a neighbor to other kinds of communities. And I do think that at least in the American evangelical faith tradition, there's a hyper individualism,
Mhm.
and it's easy to say, hey, you person over there, be nice to that other person over there, but it's a lot more complex and nuanced to say, like what does it mean for us as a community
Mhm.
to transform our enemies into friends?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that changes the whole picture to, that it still includes those individual relationships. It doesn't negate them, but
Right.
it blows the boundaries off of this really tunnel visioned view of transformation, neighborliness that Professor Andy Johnson at NTS would often recommend. Like, you, every time you encounter you, especially in the Pauline epistles, it's best to read it Southern, that y'all, all y'all, like, all y'all love your enemies. It's this corporate call. It's not just this
Hmm.
hyper individualized Christianity that we're called to embody. Um, and this really brings up, I think, what you were talking about, how it overflows out of the abundance of who we are. Because I hear a lot of, criticism that this is sort of an idealized way of living, and I think that critique overflows out of a hyper individualized reading out of it, because it's not, it doesn't seem to make sense that I would turn the other cheek and just allow myself to be abused in those things. But I don't think that's really understanding the nature of a corporate call into the realm of the kingdom of God, that we are all working together, to inhabit this reality, this way of being in the world. You had some really helpful things to say about um, nonviolence, because that's definitely a theme in this passage.
Yeah.
And before we went live, you mentioned a few things about this kind of contrast between seeing nonviolence as a tactic versus it being inherently who we are as people.
Yeah, yeah. I'm kind of knee deep in these conversations at the moment. I'm finishing up my master's in theology at Fuller, and my last class is an ethics class. It's the
Woohoo!
theology and ethics of Martin Luther King Jr. So I've got my head way deep in civil rights uh, talk and MLK and all of that. So part of it is that, like, the things I'm really deeply invested in at the moment color the way that I read the text, or impact the way that the word lands with me at this time. So that's a bit of it. But also just really trying to be involved in this kind of community neighborliness in my own context. I met with a local community organizer, who's a pastor doing significant, like, peacemaking work and racial justice here in NorCal and Oakland. His name's Ben McBride, and he's coming to speak with us at Young ClergyCon West. So a little plug for that. But I heard Ben McBride talk about a recent gathering he had with some of the civil rights leaders from MLK's movement in the South who are still living. And he had a question around the effectiveness of nonviolence. Like, does this even work? Like, why are we even doing this? If nonviolence is a strategy in that movement in the past was meant to like awaken people's consciousness or spotlight this violence inherent in the system, what do we do now when our society is so overwhelmed with violence? We're so desensitized. Like the tactic just seems outdated. And um uh Minnie Jean, who's one of the like participants in the bus boycotts and lunch counter sit-ins and stuff like that, she got so mad at Ben McBride. He said I could just see her like getting really angry, and she said, "You think nonviolence was a tactic? You think nonviolence was a strategy? It is who we were. This is how we were saving ourselves. It is our very identity. Like, it was not a tactic. This was the way that we were saving ourselves." And that left me yeah, just really thinking about the ways we can um talk about this work theoretically, or
Right.
like is this effective? Is this really working? And I do really think that comes from a hyper individualist perspective, as well as our like instant gratification. Like,
Yeah.
if I can't see the effects or the results, why would I even do it? um and and the thing is, it's so much bigger than that. The
Right.
way that Jesus calls us to be and to live is about being transformed by the power of the resurrection from the inside out. And also it is part of being, it's about being part of something that is so much bigger than who we are. It's about God's work in the world to move from creation to new creation. And we're participants in that movement of the kingdom, but we might not see the fruit of our labor.
Mm.
um, but that does not mean that it is not the way that we are being saved.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. I think we can get really caught up in theoretical conversations, uh, and kind of almost allow those things to be um, a reason not to think bigger about where I don't think we often think big enough about what Christ is calling us to be. And so it's it's really refreshing to hear that perspective of neighborliness and the inherent nature of who we are called to be, and let that our responses be shaped and formed out of who we are called to be. That we are called to live into the realm of the kingdom of God, embody that realm into other realms, as Jesus did with us, and to see how that, and to trust that God will bring about the fruit that God needs to at the right time. You
Right.
know,
And it's not about results. Like, the end of
right,
our passage is
right,
about like you receiving a reward. But we don't do what we do. We're not on this identity transformation journey to get cookies at the end. Like,
right,
that's not
right.
at all what it's about. Like
Hmm.
like we keep in step with the Spirit. We look to the example of Jesus. We participate in the mission of God in the world, because that is just who we are.
Hmm.
And it's not about like effective strategies or tactics.
Yeah,
It's about who we are becoming.
right, right. Wow, that's powerful. Well, some of the ways I think this has shaped how I'm going to approach this Sunday is I'm really hoping that 2019 to 2020, my local church turns into a people that thinks evangelistically in a communal way. That we are going to neighbor with um, our communities, and that we kind of move and shape our imaginations away from a hyper individualized only view of evangelism um, towards a very communal, neighborly form of evangelism, and that it's because of who we are that we're going to pursue that vision. So much of, and I'm sure you encounter this as well. There's so much pressure in pastoral ministry to kind of reinvent a wheel. Like there's like 210 churches in Boise alone within the city center, and it streams from all theological stripes, and my idea recently is like, why am I not hearing of partnerships between these communities that place Christ as the center? Why are there hungry people still in Boise? Why are there homeless people sleeping on the streets right near Boise State University if there are so many people that claim to follow Christ in just the city limits alone? And so how do we neighbor not just with the city that where there are people that are being hurt and oppressed in myriad of ways in poverty, but how are we also neighboring with other believers in the neighborhood? So I'm hoping to have my congregation at least start the imagination or the meditation and prayer process towards how do we become not just neighbors to ourselves and each other, which is important, but also beyond that to those that we might consider theological enemies, or that we actually neighbor with them for the care and love of our communities around us. So that's kind of where my mind is going with this text.
I love that. Thanks so much for sharing. Yeah, I'm doing work with my community as well to really lean into our understanding of ourselves as the community of God, as the people of God, to lean into a corporate and communal identity. We spent all of last year really keeping in step with Jesus. We worked through the Gospel of Mark, and now this year, following up with that, we're really keeping in step with the early church.
Oh, wow.
So in light of what we learned about who Jesus is and what Jesus said, sort of me saying almost the same thing over and over again, like Jesus is announcing the kingdom is here and it's for you. So then what does that mean? How are we forming ourselves to be a new community? How are we embodying this way that Jesus invites us into, not just as individuals, but as a group, as a family?
Yeah.
What does it mean to belong to the family of God? What does it mean to be rooted in our place? What does it mean to love our place and love our neighbors? And so thinking a lot about that from this passage as well.
That's really powerful. It's a challenge to me to never think that I've got enemy love or even love itself figured out.
Yeah.
Like we've got to continue to have our imaginations think bigger, and when we feel like we've come to a good stopping point, that's when we need to get going even more. So that's at least a personal challenge from this.
Yes. And thanks be to God, it's not about us.
Amen.
Thanks be to God, it is the power of God, the Spirit of God, the work of God in us overflowing.
Amen.
So yeah, I feel like that's a great place to send off our listeners to kind of wrap up our discussion. There's obviously so much more that we could say, but yeah, I just wanted to offer that encouragement to all of y'all preparing to preach this weekend. Let your community know that they are loved, that they are empowered by God and sent out as forces of change and transformation in the community. As always, check out our website for the stellar commentaries that are posted there. Follow us on all the social media platforms. Send us your questions and thoughts and comments. We would love to hear from you. Yeah. Any last words, Ben?
I know. I think you kept it off well. I'll see you next week and see those who are listening next week as well.
Preach on.
Preach on.